Our reading today is found in Luke 1:59 through 64. Verses 62 and 63 say, "And they made signs to his father how he would have him called. And he asked for a writing tablet and wrote, saying, His name is John. And they all marveled." It was going to be a big day for Zechariah's little family. The baby would receive his name and the covenant sign of circumcision, declaring him one of God's chosen people. But Zechariah knew God had already named and chosen him regardless of the outward sign. Mary stood at the door and welcomed the neighbors and relatives who had come to celebrate and witness. As Zechariah watched their guests file in, he counted them. 10 witnesses would satisfy the requirements of the law, and they were well beyond that now. His heart was heavy. Traditionally, Zechariah would have the honor of performing the ceremony, but because he could not speak, his cousin, who served with him as a priest, would do the honors. Disappointed as he was, it was clear to Zechariah that God's plan was in full spring, and 9 months of silence had given him plenty of time to consider what it meant to take God at his word. He should have believed God from the beginning. There was so much to be said, and yet he couldn't speak. There they were on the eve of a new era, and Zechariah alone knew all the angel's words. He would ready his people to receive the saving king he had promised so many years ago. Israel would finally be free from centuries of political turbulence, wars, and illegitimate, paranoid kings, and he could not even speak of it. Sometimes he felt he would explode. Everyone was in place and the ceremony was underway. The little baby's cheeks reddened and he opened his mouth in painful protest. Elizabeth nursed him back to a calm, and the blessing was given. The ladies hovered over Elizabeth and the baby, smiling and nodding, all chattering at the same time. One of them glanced towards Zechariah and back to the baby. They were all in agreement. All but Elizabeth. She looked at Zechariah knowingly. She shook her head and said, "No, his name is John." Zechariah smiled and she returned a nod. He knew they wouldn't like it. At his age, he had fewer years left than he had already lived. And of course, they wanted a baby to carry on the name to the next generation, but this child's name would carry on another name and another message. And each of these unforgettable events would have them talking and looking for a savior, the Messiah. He wanted to chuckle at all the disgruntled faces. The dissatisfied group turned to him with questioning expressions. They marched toward him and gestured with enthusiasm. "What will his name be called?" Zechariah motioned toward his cousin's satchel and pretended to write on his own hand. They understood and brought him a wooden plank lightly coated with wax. With a stylus, he wrote in the wax, "His name is John." He held out the writing pad for all concerned women to see. Confusion replaced their worried irritation. All the hype emotion of the moment ago drained from their faces, and he chuckled. What was that? He heard himself laughing. Elizabeth's sweet voice, like a breath of fresh air, confirmed the name. "I know there is no one in our family called John, but that's his name." Zechariah was overwhelmed with emotion. He slid from the chair to the floor and on bended knee raised his hands and voice to heaven. The long silenced blessing, the swelling praise, and the angel's message erupted and began to speak in broken sobs. "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, because he has come to his people and redeemed them." Every chattering guest hushed and turned toward the frail father, worshiping aloud. With his audience in stunned silence, he declared the news at last. "He has raised up a horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David, as he said through the holy prophets of long ago, salvation from our enemies and from the hand of all who hate us. Oh, show mercy on our ancestors and to remember his holy covenant, the oath he swore to our father Abraham, to rescue us from the hand of our enemies and to enable us to serve him without fear in holiness and righteousness before him all his days." Luke 1:68-75. Zechariah supported himself on the chair and pushed himself up to stand. He walked carefully to Elizabeth and to the baby, and with one hand around her shoulder and one hand on John, He leaned over them both. Tears rolled down his quivering beard as he blessed his son. And you, my son, will be called a prophet of the Most High, for you will go on before the Lord to prepare the way for him, to give his people the knowledge of salvation through the forgiveness of their sins, because of the tender mercies of our God, by which the rising sun will come to us from heaven to shine on those living in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet with the path of peace. Luke 1:76 to 79. Zechariah bowed his head and thanked God silently, but this time by choice, for the blessing of silence and speech. When God applies his gracious intervention of discipline, Zechariah's doubtful skepticism is transformed into a worship song of absolute certainty, as surely as the sun rises. And now his own son's name would be a standing stone, a means to remember, like the rocks pulled from the Jordan River when their fathers walked across on dry land. In obedience, they were set up as a monument, so that when their children asked, "What are the stones for?" they could recount the workings of their miraculous God. How gracious of God to command Zechariah and Elizabeth to set a stone of remembrance on their son, his name, so that whenever someone asks, "Why did you name him John?" "There's no one in your family named John." Zechariah and Elizabeth could recount the work of their miraculous God and declare, "We named him John because God is gracious." What stones of remembrance has God given you? Lord, give us a heart like Zechariah, one that accepts due discipline as a great grace, one that endures discipline and learns to trust, and one that has no response but praise when it has finally learned what you have taught. And thanks for listening today. I'll see you tomorrow.